Hey, fourth graders, let's talk about the War of 1812. Now, if you know your flags, you might notice that there's an American flag and a British flag in this picture. And if you know your social studies, you might be wondering, hang on a second, didn't America and Great Britain just fight a war? The Revolutionary War? Didn't that war result in American independence from Great Britain and the creation of the United States? Yes, you're right. And you'll find that the Americans and the British went to war again after that. So you might be wondering why, and we're going to get to the bottom of that in this video. Let's go. So this fellow may look familiar to you. The hand in his vest is his signature move in paintings and pictures. That's how he's portrayed. And his name is Napoleon Bonaparte. And hopefully his name sounds familiar. He was Emperor of France at the time. 1802, he became Emperor of France. And he had this expensive habit of invading the neighboring countries around France. So he was trying to conquer most of Europe at the time. And if you remember the Louisiana Purchase lessons, that's why the Americans were able to buy the Louisiana Territory for so cheap, because this guy didn't have any money left and he was desperate for cash. So he sold that land to Thomas Jefferson, really quite unexpectedly. So here's Europe in 1812. Napoleon is fighting his wars, invading his neighbors, and just seeming to have a good old time of it, and he was almost successful. However, the British declared war on France to put a stop to Napoleon and his invasions. Here's a very unflattering political cartoon of Napoleon carving up the globe and taking the biggest slice of Europe for himself. So, you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with America anyway? Isn't this all going on in Europe? Aren't we learning about westward expansion of the United States? Well, you'll see, I promise. So the British had a great navy, and they had a lot of really fancy warships, but nobody really wanted to sign on to be a sailor in the British Navy. Life as a sailor was tough. The food was terrible. You were gone from home for long stretches. And if you made a mistake, you could be flogged. That means beaten. So needless to say, people weren't necessarily lining up to become British sailors at this time. And unfortunately, what happened to fill the need for sailors was that these groups called press gangs would roam the streets of Great Britain, kidnapping young men and forcing them to become sailors on their ship. Yikes. Okay, so you're still probably wondering, what does this have to do with America? Here's what happens next. When that wasn't enough to fill their ships with sailors, the British started invading or attacking American ships, kidnapping those sailors and forcing them to work on British ships. Now, yes, kidnapping, that sounds a lot like kidnapping. I'm sure you know this word. But in this circumstance, it has a special name, and it was called impressment. And the impressment of American sailors was really starting to make Americans mad. And they were mad at the British for some other reasons too. Think back to before the American Revolution. The British had built forts just west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the Americans won the revolution, and the British had promised to hand over these forts. But here we are, 29 years later, almost 3 decades later, and the Revolutionary War has ended, long time ago now, and the British are still hanging on to these forts. They're not letting the settlers move west into the land that they claimed for the United States. The other thing that was going on is that the British were protecting the Native American tribes that were living in this area. So the settlers wanted to continue moving westward onto the land that they believed was theirs. And the Native Americans were here angry that whites wanted to seize their land and being supported by the British. So the United States is not happy about this. All of these things taken into consideration, tensions are growing high. Things are becoming very tense. And in 1812, this is the president at the time, James Madison. And in 1812, he declares war on Great Britain. And you can see here, everywhere there's a little red burst, that's where a battle took place. You can see that most of the fighting took place along the Great Lakes. And there are a couple of things going on here. So one was that since the Americans had declared war, they thought they might try to take over some of this territory, which today is Canada, but at the time was a British colony still. They didn't end up taking over any of Canada, but they did go to the Canadian capital, York. Today it's called Toronto, and they burnt the Parliament building, which was like the main building of government at the time. So that was a big blow to the British and to British Canada. The other thing going on here was that the Native Americans were helping the British to fight against the Americans. So what's going on over in Europe with Napoleon and his wars? Well, the British finally defeat Napoleon in 1814. Sorry, Napoleon. This isn't good for you. It's not good for France, but it's also not good for the United States. Why? Well, with Napoleon off their backs, Great Britain can focus all of their energy on the war going on in the United States. So, it's time for some revenge. Remember how I told you how they burnt the Parliament building in York in Canada? The Americans burnt the Parliament building. Well, here come the British to Washington, D.C. And if you know about America, you know that Washington, D.C. is the capital of the country. And they burned the home of U.S. Congress. They burned the Capitol building. So it's sort of like an eye for an eye. You know, you burn our Parliament building, we're going to burn your Capitol building. And then they destroyed all of the books in the Library of Congress. So super valuable stuff there. Then they headed for the president's house. President Madison wasn't home at the time, but his wife Dolly was, and she loved to entertain, and she was about to give a dinner party. What is Dolly Madison going to do? So she heard the British were planning to attack the White House. She packed as many valuables as she could: velvet curtains, silver, important papers, and lots of other stuff. She packed them into wagons to be taken to safety. And the most important thing that she's remembered for that night is she made sure that this portrait of George Washington was safe just before she fled the building. When the British arrived, they ate the dinner she had planned to have with her friends. And then they set fire to the president's mansion. The White House burned. So that's a pretty dramatic place to stop, but I'm going to leave you on that cliffhanger and ask you this question. How do you think things are going to turn out? How will it end? Now, we'll get around to that in our next video. Thanks for watching.